The door swung open with a reluctant creak, letting in the harsh, artificial glow of the streetlights outside. A gust of dry, recycled air carried the scent of rust and ozone, the unmistakable signature of a station built to last but left to decay. The bar's patrons barely looked up, just another group of off-worlders passing through. But Jeb noticed. He always did. The newcomers were bigger than most who wandered into his establishment. Their armor, dark and ridged like the hide of some ancient predator, marked them as warriors of the Crawlet Dominion, a species known less for their diplomacy and more for their tendency to leave a trail of scorched earth wherever they went. Jeb kept his expression neutral, his hand steady as he wiped down the worn counter. He had seen their kind before. The arrogance in their posture, the way they moved like they owned the space, told him everything he needed to know. They weren't here for a quiet drink. The leader of the group stepped forward, his heavy boots clanking against the reinforced floor. His mandibles twitched in amusement as his black eyes scanned the dimly lit bar. "Humans," he rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of mockery, always gathering in such primitive places. A few of the patrons tensed, but none dared to respond. The Crawlet thrived on provocation, on displays of dominance, and challenging them outright was a fool's game. Jeb, however, simply tossed a rag over his shoulder and met the warrior's gaze with an unimpressed stare. "You here to drink, or just hear yourself talk?" His voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that had nothing to prove. The Crawlet warriors exchanged glances before bursting into deep, guttural laughter. The leader leaned against the bar, his clawed fingers drumming against the metal surface. "I like you, old man. You've got a mouth on you. It's a shame your kind never learned when to stay quiet." Jeb let the words hang between them, offering nothing in return. He reached for a glass, pouring a measured amount of amber liquid from an unlabeled bottle. He slid it across the counter toward the alien without a word. The warrior's amusement faltered for a brief second before he grabbed the glass and sniffed at the contents. "Human swill," he sneered but took a sip nonetheless. His mandibles clicked in mild surprise. "Stronger than it looks. I'll give you that." Jeb smirked but said nothing. He had no interest in winning their approval. The sooner they drank and left, the better. Unfortunately, that wasn't their plan. One of the younger warriors, emboldened by his leader's casual cruelty, stepped away from the group and began examining the bar's interior with exaggerated disdain. His eyes landed on a dusty, framed photograph hanging behind the counter. With a derisive snort, he reached for it. Jeb's fingers tightened around the bar, but he didn't move. "Not yet." The warrior plucked the frame from the wall and turned it over in his clawed hands. "What's this?" he mused, his voice thick with amusement. "A relic from the old days?" The leader leaned in, curious. When he saw the image, grainy, black and white, a younger man in a military uniform standing beside soldiers bearing insignias that no longer graced the stars, his amusement sharpened into something crueler. "You were a soldier," he said, not a question, but a statement filled with derision. "That explains why you still think you matter." The younger warrior, encouraged by the reaction, tightened his grip on the frame and shattered it against the bar's edge. Glass rained onto the counter, tiny shards catching the dim light. For the first time, Jeb stopped moving. The room went still. The soft hum of neon lights and the occasional drip from a faulty pipe were the only sounds that filled the space. The few human patrons, those who knew better, straightened in their seats. A shift in the air, barely perceptible, had changed everything. Jeb exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Now that," he murmured, brushing a few slivers of glass on the counter, "was a mistake." The younger warrior bared his teeth, stepping forward. "You don't give orders here, old man." Jeb didn't look at him. Instead, he reached under the bar, his fingers finding something beneath the counter. A dull clank echoed as he pulled a heavy metal bar across the entrance, sealing the door with a finality that sent a ripple of unease through the room. One of the older patrons shifted in his seat. Another subtly adjusted the position of his drink, as if making room for something else on the table. The Crawlet leader's amusement flickered, just for a moment, before returning with full force. "What do you think you're doing?" Jeb finally met his gaze, his expression unreadable. making sure none of you leave until I've made my point." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Jeb reached beneath the counter again. This time, when his hand emerged, it wasn't holding a glass. The air inside the bar grew thick, charged with something ancient and unspoken. The younger Kralith warrior, still emboldened by his earlier act of disrespect, took a step forward, his claws flexing, his mandibles twitching in anticipation. Jeb, however, remained still, his gaze locked on the leader of the group, not the fool too eager for violence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Jeb placed something on the counter with a dull thunk. The room seemed to exhale as all eyes fell on the object. It was small, unassuming, a worn insignia with edges dulled by time. But for those who knew, truly knew, it carried a weight far heavier than its size. The leader's mandibles twitched. He reached out, plucking the insignia between two claws, turning it over. His black eyes narrowed slightly. "You boys ever heard of the siege of Corthan 9? Jeb's voice was casual, but something coiled beneath it, something tightly leashed. The younger warrior scoffed, his ignorance apparent. "Why should we care about some human skirmish from Shut up." The leader's voice was barely above a growl. The younger warrior's mouth snapped shut, confusion flickering across his face. Jeb leaned on the counter, watching the leader carefully. "Guess you do know the name." The Kralith's grip on the insignia tightened. His soldiers looked to him now, sensing the shift, the subtle ripple of unease that had begun to spread through their leader's stance. Jeb continued, his voice even. 50 human soldiers. That's all they sent. The Dominion had 3,000 warriors stationed on Corthan 9, ready to burn that colony to ground. 3 days later, those 50 humans walked out. He let the words settle, let the truth of them sink in. "And what happened to the 3,000? He asked, his gaze still steady. No one spoke. The leader's claws curled against the insignia, his body tense in a way that was not born of anger but recognition. Jeb took a slow breath. "They sent me and my men in to make sure the Dominion never set foot on that colony again. And we made damn sure you didn't." The younger warrior, still too foolish to understand the weight of what he was hearing, sneered. "You expect us to believe you were there? That you?" Jeb moved before the warrior could finish his sentence. One moment, he was behind the bar. The next, he was over it, moving with a speed that had no place in an aging man's body. His boot caught the younger warrior's knee, twisting it at an unnatural angle. A wet pop filled the air as the alien dropped, a strangled cry escaping his throat. The others reacted instantly, weapons shifting in their hands. But Jeb had already stepped back, slow and deliberate, as if the moment hadn't happened at all. The younger warrior writhed on the floor, his leg bent in a way that nature never intended. His pain was irrelevant. The message had been sent. Jeb adjusted his sleeves, his voice calm. "I've killed your kind before," he said, not as a boast, but as a statement of fact. "And I was better at it than anyone else you've ever met." The bar was silent again, the tension suffocating. The leader finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "You were the one they called the Ghost of Corthan 9. Jeb gave a small nod. The title wasn't one he'd chosen for himself. It had been whispered through the Dominion ranks, muttered with a mix of fear and hatred. A man who fought like a phantom, who turned the battlefield into a graveyard, who made sure no Kralith soldier left with a clean death. One of the other warriors shifted uncomfortably. "This is a trick," he muttered. But the words lacked conviction. Jeb stepped back behind the bar, wiping his hands on a rag, as if none of it mattered. "Believe what you want," he said, pouring himself a drink. "Won't change the truth." The leader's eyes flicked to the younger warrior still groaning on the floor, then back to Jeb. "What do you want?" Jeb took a sip of his drink, savoring it. Then he placed the glass down with deliberate care. "I want you to understand something," he said. "You walk into a human bar, looking down on us, thinking we're weak. You laugh at men like me because we don't carry rifles anymore, because we serve drinks instead of taking lives." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make them listen. "But the thing about humans, the thing your kind never really understood, is that we remember every war, every loss, Every single son and daughter we've buried because your dominion thought we were too small to fight back. And we don't forget. Ever. His fingers tapped lightly against the bar, a slow, measured rhythm. You mock us because we stopped fighting. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. But that's not the same as forgetting how. The leader watched him, unreadable. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached down, grabbed his wounded soldier, and hauled him up with one arm. Jeb lifted a brow. You leaving? The leader's voice was quieter than before. Not yet. Jeb gave a slow nod, as if he had expected as much. Didn't think so, he murmured, reaching under the bar again. This time, when his hand emerged, the object it held wasn't a relic. It was a weapon, and the bar was about to become a battlefield. Jeb's fingers wrapped around the grip of the weapon, an old but well-maintained plasma revolver. It wasn't the kind of sidearm carried by peacekeepers or smugglers. No, this was military grade, designed for precision, for survival, for ensuring that the person on the other end didn't get back up. The Kralith warriors tensed, but they didn't move. Not yet. The leader's black eyes flickered between the weapon and Jeb's face, reading the moment, assessing the danger. You think that scares us? The leader finally asked, his voice calm, but no longer mocking. Jeb let out a quiet chuckle, the kind that carried no humor. I don't need you to be scared, he said, adjusting his grip. I just need you to be smart. A heavy silence settled over the bar. The wounded warrior on the floor gritted his teeth, his mandibles twitching with restrained fury. One of the others reached for his sidearm, just a subtle shift, but Jeb caught it. Don't. Jeb warned, his voice like iron. You don't want to know how fast I still am. The warrior hesitated, his fingers hovering over his holster. His leader gave a slight shake of his head, a wordless command to stand down. Jeb exhaled slowly. His muscles didn't ache the way they should have for a man his age, and the revolver sat in his grip like it had never left. It was familiar, too familiar. He had promised himself long ago that he wouldn't be that man again, but some promises were made to be broken. You want to know the difference between a warrior and a soldier? Jeb asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The Kralith leader remained still, watching him carefully. Jeb tapped the side of his head with his free hand. A warrior fights for glory. A soldier fights to end things, to make damn sure he never has to come back to the battlefield. You came in here looking for a fight because you thought it would make you feel powerful. But I fight to make sure men like you never walk away. Something shifted in the leader's gaze. You think you're still that man? He asked, his voice quieter now. Jeb rolled his shoulders, flexing his grip on the revolver. Let's find out. The leader's expression hardened. So be it. It happened fast. The moment the leader's hand twitched toward his own weapon, Jeb moved. A flash of light erupted from the revolver, the shot precise, controlled. The plasma bolt struck the leader's shoulder, sending him staggering back with a grunt. The other warriors reacted instantly, drawing their weapons, but Jeb was already in motion. The first shot was a warning. The second was not. A second warrior barely had time to aim before a bolt took him in the leg, dropping him to one knee. The remaining two spread out, trying to flank, but Jeb was already tracking them. His movements were deliberate, honed by years of instinct. One of the warriors fired, a wild, desperate shot that burned a hole into the liquor shelf behind him. Jeb ducked low, rolled across the bar's surface, and fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot knocked the weapon from a clawed hand. The second sent the warrior crashing into a table, unconscious before he hit the ground. The last standing Kralith hesitated, his weapon still raised but shaking slightly. Jeb turned to him, calm and steady. Go on, he said. Try it. The warrior's mandibles clicked in frustration. His pride screamed at him to fight, but his instincts, his training, told him the truth. This wasn't a battle. This was an execution waiting to happen. Slowly, deliberately, the last warrior lowered his weapon. Jeb nodded. Smart. The leader, still clutching his wounded shoulder, let out a slow, pained chuckle. You're not just some old bartender. Jeb holstered his revolver, his expression unreadable. Never said I was. For a long moment, No one moved. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the station's distant machinery and slow, labored breathing of the defeated warriors. The leader finally pushed himself upright, wincing. He met Jeb's gaze, and though the arrogance had been stripped away, there was something else now, something almost like respect. "You could have killed us," the leader said. Jeb exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have walked through that door in the first place." The leader studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Without another word, he turned and motioned for his remaining conscious soldier to grab their fallen comrades. Together, they moved toward the exit. Jeb reached for the bar's control panel and released the lock with a soft click. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. As the leader stepped through, he paused. "Next time," he said, glancing back over his shoulder, "we won't underestimate you." Jeb smirked, leaning against the bar. "Next time," he said, "don't come back at all." The door shut behind them, sealing the bar in silence once more. Jeb sighed, rolling his shoulders, feeling the old tension settling in again. He glanced down at the broken glass, the scattered bottles, the scorch marks from stray shots. Then, shaking his head, he reached for a fresh glass and poured himself a drink. Some nights, a man just needed a drink. Jeb sat in the quiet aftermath, the bar still thick with the scent of plasma burns and spilled liquor. The revolver rested on the counter beside him, its surface worn but not forgotten. He stared at it for a long moment, fingers tracing the edge of the grip, feeling the weight of something far heavier than metal. The patrons, the ones who had remained silent to the whole ordeal, finally stirred. A few adjusted their seats, their gazes cautious but not fearful. They had suspected for years that Jeb was more than just a bartender, but now they knew. A man near the corner, an old spacer with gray in his beard and years in his eyes, raised his drink slightly. "Didn't think I'd ever see the ghost of Corthan. 9 serve me whiskey," he murmured. Jeb smirked but didn't respond. He just picked up his own glass and took a slow sip. Another patron, younger, barely more than a kid, leaned forward. His voice was hushed with something like awe. "You really fought there?" Jeb exhaled, setting his drink down. "Yeah." The kid hesitated, glancing at the scorch marks on the wall. "And you just stopped fighting?" Jeb looked at him then, really looked at him. The kid still had that shine in his eyes, the kind that only came before a man had seen too much. He recognized it all too well. "You ever hold a friend's hand while he bled out?" Jeb asked, his voice quiet. "Ever hear a man beg to go home when you know damn well he won't?" The kid swallowed, his bravado faltering. Jeb held his gaze. "War's not glory, son. It's a debt, and we all pay it one way or another." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was something else, something heavier. Jeb reached for a cloth, started wiping down the counter, as if the night's events hadn't just happened. The routine felt good, normal, but something had shifted. A soft chime sounded from the door panel, and Jeb's eyes flicked up. Not another Krolith. This time, it was someone different. A woman, human, dressed in the sharp uniform of the Colonial Security Bureau. She stepped inside, taking a slow glance around the bar, at the scorch marks, the broken glass, the overturned tables. Then finally her eyes settled on Jeb. "Bit of trouble tonight?" she asked. Jeb kept wiping the counter. "Nothing I couldn't handle." She stepped closer, leaning a hip against the bar. "You always handle Dominion warriors like that?" Jeb poured her a drink without asking. "Only when they make me." She picked up the glass, studying the amber liquid. "You know," she said, voice casual, "word travels fast, especially when it involves an old war ghost putting a handful of Dominion warriors on the floor." Jeb didn't respond. He didn't need to. She took a slow sip, then set the glass down. "They'll be back." Jeb nodded once. "I know." The woman watched him, her expression unreadable. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small data chip, and placed it on the bar. "In case you decide you're tired of pouring drinks," she said. Jeb stared at the chip for a long moment. It was nothing special, just a sliver of metal and circuitry. But he knew what it meant. A door left open. An old path, waiting to be walked again. He picked it up, rolled it between his fingers, then slid it back across the bar. "I think I'll stick to bartending," he said. The woman smirked. "Suit yourself." She downed the rest of her drink, placed a few credits on the counter, and turned for the door. Just before she stepped out, she glanced back. "For what it's worth," she said, "we could use men like you again." Jeb just shook his head. "That's the problem," he murmured. "You always could." The door hissed shut behind her, leaving him alone with the quiet hum of the bar. He exhaled, slow and steady, then reached for a fresh glass. Some ghosts belonged in the past, and some men just wanted to pour drinks. At least, until the next time someone made the mistake of thinking he had forgotten how to fight.